Hey guys. So tonight we're floating back, all the way to ancient Rome. But don't worry, we're not going to get lost in endless Latin grammar drills or Julius Caesar cosplay. This is the sleepy version. The dim the lights, sip some tea, and listen to the Roman Republic collapse under the weight of too many egos version. Because really, that's what the Battle of Actium was. Not just some naval scuffle in 31 BCE, but the final stage of Rome saying, you know what? Democracy was fun, but how about we just hand everything to one guy and call it a day? Now, of course, Rome didn't exactly have democracy in the modern sense. Don't picture senators in togas being the same as senators today. Although, to be fair, the mix of arrogance, corruption, and dramatic speeches probably wasn't all that different. But by the time we reach the late 1st century BCE, Rome's so-called republic had been reduced to a sad performance. The stage was still there. The Senate, the magistrates, the elections, but behind the curtain, absolute chaos. And when you have too many powerful men who refuse to play nicely, well, eventually someone starts hoarding all the toys. So, where do we begin? Let's rewind a bit. Because to understand the whole Mark Antony versus Octavian showdown at Actium, you need to see the messy buildup. The years of backstabbing, ego trips, and family drama that could honestly fill several seasons of a trashy Netflix political drama. Everything spirals, really, with Julius Caesar. The man himself. The overachiever, the guy who was supposed to be just another ambitious Roman general, but instead ended up becoming the face on coins, the name for kings, and the man who gets stabbed by too many friends. Caesar's problem, or let's call it his gift for self-destruction, was that he didn't know when to stop winning. He conquered Gaul, he marched on Rome, he pardoned enemies who then plotted against him, and he basically collected power the way some people collect Funko Pops. By 44 BCE, Caesar had been declared dictator perpetuo, dictator for life, which, is just a very fancy way of saying we are definitely not pretending this is a republic anymore. And of course, the Senate hated that. Not because they hated tyranny and principle, most of them would have loved to be tyrants themselves, but because Caesar wasn't sharing. So, stabby stabby, on the Ides of March, 44 BCE. Caesar's body falls at the base of Pompey's statue, which is either poetic or just incredibly awkward for Pompey's ghost. And boom, the so-called liberators think they've saved the Republic. Spoiler, they did not. So Caesar's dead. The Senate is confused. Rome is on edge. Who takes over? First up, Mark Antony, Caesar's bestie, his right-hand man, his drinking buddy, his warrior bro. Antony was charismatic, loud, probably fun at parties, but not exactly the picture of discipline. He was the guy who liked power, but hated paperwork. Think less political mastermind, and more warrior frat guy who suddenly thinks he can run a country. Then there's Octavian, Caesar's grandnephew, technically, but also his adopted son in his will, which was a surprise to basically everyone, including Octavian, who at that time was a rather unassuming 18-year-old with a suspiciously fragile body and a habit of playing the long game. Octavian didn't look much. He wasn't strong, wasn't flashy, and honestly came across more as a sickly bookworm than a future emperor. But he had the two things that mattered: Caesar's name and Caesar's money. Oh, and the ability to smile politely while plotting your destruction. A skill that would serve him very, very well. Now, if Rome had been a sane place, maybe the Senate could have restored the Republic after Caesar's death. Maybe power would have been shared. Maybe elections could have meant something again. But Rome was not a sane place. Instead, you get the Liberators' Civil War. Brutus and Cassius, the main stabby duo, gather troops in the east. Antony and Octavian, who really don't like each other, suddenly realize they need each other, because both want to cash in on Caesar's murder, but neither can do it alone. So they team up. Add in Lepidus, kind of a political filler character, and you've got the second triumvirate. 3 men, absolute power, Rome carved up like a pizza. And like all political pizzas, it got greasy fast. They hunted down Caesar's assassins, crushed Brutus and Cassius at Philippi in 42 BCE, and filled Rome with prescriptions, basically legalized murder lists. If your name was on the list, you died, your property was seized, and someone else got richer. Fun times. Cicero, the famous orator, made the mistake of talk-trashing Antony in a series of speeches. So Antony, being a sensitive soul, had him killed. His head and hands were nailed to the rostra in the Roman Forum, because subtlety wasn't really Antony's thing. After Philippi, things start to drift apart. Antony takes control of the east, Octavian controls the west. Lepidus gets Sicily and is promptly sidelined because, honestly, who was ever betting on Lepidus? And it's in the east that Antony meets Cleopatra. Yes, that Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, icon of ancient drama, serial romancer of powerful Romans. Cleopatra was brilliant, ambitious, and fully aware that aligning with Rome's top dogs was the best way to keep Egypt independent. She'd already had a fling with Julius Caesar, producing a son, Little Caesar. Now, Antony becomes her new Roman partner. And not just in the political sense. Their relationship was passionate, public, and, in Roman eyes, scandalous. Antony wasn't just messing around with a foreign queen. He was essentially living like a pharaoh, dressing Eastern, throwing luxury feasts, raising kids with Cleopatra. It was not a great look if you were supposed to be a Roman statesman. Octavian, of course, notices this, and he files it away like a good little schemer. Meanwhile, while Antony is busy playing Egyptian royal, Octavian is busy in Rome, carefully curating his image. He marries well, he divorces strategically, he positions himself as the defender of traditional Roman values, the savior of Italy, the guy who takes care of the veterans and secures the grain supply. In other words, he's branding himself as the responsible Roman adult while painting Antony as the reckless foreign sellout. It works. Slowly but surely, the Senate, the Italian elites, even the common people start to see Octavian as the safer bet. Because if history teaches us anything, it's that people will usually go with the boring administrator over the flashy disaster. By the late 30s BCE, the alliance is basically over. Lepidus has been pushed out. Octavian and Antony are circling each other like two cats in an alley. And then Octavian pulls his trump card. He gets hold of Antony's will, or at least what he claims is Antony's will. The details are murky, but the gist is this.
Octavian presents it to the Senate, and it says Antony wants to be buried in Alexandria with Cleopatra, not Rome. Alexandria. Cue outrage, because nothing screams traitor in Roman years like choosing an Egyptian burial with your foreign lover. Whether the will was real, forged, or creatively edited doesn't really matter. Octavian uses it perfectly. He declares war, not on Antony directly, but on Cleopatra, which is clever, because now it's not Roman versus Roman, it's Rome versus Egypt. And Antony, by siding with Cleopatra, basically paints a big target on his back. So in 31 BCE, the two sides finally clash.
So here we are, 31 BCE. The summer is hot, the sea air heavy, and two very different visions of Rome are about to smack into each other on the waters off western Greece. On one side, Mark Antony, with Cleopatra by his side, the proud fleet of the East. Sleek ships, packed with soldiers, money, and the weight of their shared gamble. They weren't just fighting for a battle. They were fighting for the right to reshape Rome, to make it something different, maybe even something Egyptian. On the other side, Octavian, calm, steady, suspiciously sickly looking, but very much in control. His admiral, Agrippa, is running the show at sea. Octavian himself is on land, pacing, pretending to be braver than he looks, but absolutely determined. This isn't just a war. This is his audition to be Rome's one and only ruler. The location? Actium, a little promontory in western Greece. Not exactly a glamorous setting, but convenient enough. Antony had parked his forces there months earlier. Cleopatra had joined him, and Octavian had decided, fine, if Antony wants to hole up, we'll just choke him out. And that's pretty much how the summer went. Agrippa used his fleet to cut off Antony's supply lines, snatching up coastal bases, squeezing tighter and tighter. It wasn't flashy, but it was devastating. Armies don't run on glory. They run on grain. And Antony's troops were getting hungrier, crankier, and less loyal by the day. Antony had a choice. He could have retreated into the eastern provinces and regrouped, but pride is a killer. And he wasn't about to slink away while Octavian strutted around Italy. So instead, he stayed, gambling that he could break out by sea. Now, let's pause on the fleets themselves, because the difference here is almost comical. Antony's fleet was big, huge, filled with massive lumbering warships. Think floating fortresses, bristling with towers and soldiers, and more weight than the sea really wanted to carry. Cleopatra's Egyptian ships were sleek and fast, but the core of Antony's navy, overweight beasts. Octavian's fleet, by contrast, was lean, smaller ships, lighter, more maneuverable. They weren't glamorous, but they didn't need to be. Agrippa knew how to use them like knives against Antony's floating castles. So, September 2nd, 31 BCE, the day of Actium, the fleets line up. Antony's ships stretch out across the strait. Cleopatra's ships are in reserve, tucked in behind. Octavian's fleet, commanded by Agrippa, takes its time. No rushing, just waiting, letting the wind shift, letting Antony sweat. The hours drag. Neither side wants to make the first big move. Imagine thousands of oarsmen sweating, just sitting there. Soldiers leaning on shields, watching the horizon. And both commanders stalling because nobody really wants to be the one who blunders. Finally, Antony's fleet edges forward. Slowly, painfully slowly. And the fighting begins. Now, don't picture explosions or cinematic chaos. This is ancient naval warfare. Ships ramming ships, grappling hooks, soldiers trying to board enemy decks and hack each other apart. Lots of shouting, lots of straining at the oars, lots of splintered wood. It's brutal, but it's also slow. Antony's big ships lumber forward. Octavian's lighter ships dart around them, nipping at their flanks, cutting off stragglers. It's not glamorous, but it's effective. And then, Cleopatra. At the height of the fighting, Cleopatra suddenly orders her 60 ships to break out. They unfurl their sails, catch the wind, and bolt south, straight past the battling fleets, heading for the open sea. And Antony? He follows her. That's right. In the middle of the battle, Antony abandons his fleet, takes a handful of ships, and chases after Cleopatra. Because love, pride, desperation, whatever you want to call it, overruled everything else. The rest of Antony's fleet, seeing their commander gone, collapses. Some fight on stubbornly, others surrender, others burn. Agrippa and Octavian mop it up. And just like that, the so-called decisive battle is over. Not with some grand final stand, not with a dramatic slaughter, but with Antony literally sailing away after Cleopatra, leaving tens of thousands of men behind to fend for themselves. It's almost anticlimactic, almost too pathetic to count as a great clash of history. But that's the irony, because that anticlimax is exactly why it mattered. Octavian didn't just win a battle. He won the image war. Antony had abandoned his men for an Egyptian queen. Octavian stood as the sober, dependable Roman victor. And Rome noticed. Oh, did they notice? After Actium, Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt. Octavian returned to Italy, triumphant, his propaganda machine spinning at full tilt. The war wasn't technically over yet, but the story was. The Republic had chosen its winner. So yes, Actium was a battle. Ships clashed, men died, waves churned. But more than that, it was theater. The final act of a republic collapsing into one man's hands. And in the calm aftermath, Octavian, sickly, cautious, endlessly patient Octavian, emerged not just as Caesar's heir, but something bigger, something permanent. And that, in the slow rhythm of history, is how one sea battle, half won by strategy and half won by Antony's bad decision-making, ended centuries of messy Roman politics. The Republic had officially dozed off, and the Empire was waking up.
So, after Actium, things look bleak for Antony and Cleopatra. They've sailed off to Egypt with the remains of their dignity, which isn't much. Behind them, they've left most of their fleet destroyed, their allies dead or defecting, and their reputation in Rome shredded. Octavian doesn't even need to rush. He takes his time, slowly dismantling Antony's support system. Provinces fall into line, governors switch sides, armies surrender without a fight. Antony and Cleopatra are still technically rulers, but they're rulers of a shrinking bubble, and everyone knows it. In Alexandria, Cleopatra does what Cleopatra always does. She tries to spin the situation. She's still the queen. She still hosts lavish banquets. She still wraps herself in the image of Isis, divine consort, goddess queen. But underneath the gold and perfume, there's panic. Because she knows Octavian is coming, and Egypt is not ready to withstand him. Antony, meanwhile, spirals. His reputation as a commander is in ruins. He knows Rome thinks he abandoned his men for Cleopatra. He knows his enemies call him weak, broken, whipped. And instead of proving them wrong, he sulks, he drinks, he lashes out. This once charismatic, loud battlefield general becomes a shadow of himself, pacing halls, drowning in regret. And the months tick by. Octavian arrives in 30 BCE. His forces march steadily toward Alexandria. There's no grand resistance, no second Actium. The city braces for the inevitable. Now, Roman historians, especially those writing under Octavian's later rule, love to dramatize this part. They paint Antony as utterly defeated, Cleopatra as scheming to the end, and Octavian as calm and calculating. The truth is probably messier, but the broad strokes are clear. Antony tries, one last time, to rally his troops. He stages a final defense of Alexandria. But it doesn't last. His forces are outnumbered, outmatched, and demoralized. And then comes the end. When Antony hears, falsely, that Cleopatra is dead, he decides to join her. He falls on his own sword. Only in classic Antony fashion, he manages to botch it. Instead of dying quickly, he collapses, bleeding, still alive. Word comes that Cleopatra isn't actually dead. So his servants carry him, broken and gasping, to her. The two meet one final time in the mausoleum she's already had built, because Cleopatra was practical like that. If you're a queen in ancient times, you keep your tomb ready. Antony dies in her arms, a tragic echo of all the passion and chaos they shared. Cleopatra, now alone, knows what's coming. Octavian enters Alexandria. She tries diplomacy, charm, negotiation, but it's no use. Octavian doesn't want her as a partner. He wants her as a trophy, a chained queen paraded through Rome in his triumph. And Cleopatra refuses that fate. The exact details are debated. The famous story is the asp, the poisonous snake smuggled in a basket of figs. Maybe true, maybe just a dramatic flourish. Others suggest poison paste applied to her skin or a sharp hidden blade. However she does it, Cleopatra dies on her own terms. Her servants Eros and Charmian die with her, loyal to the end. Octavian finds her body, furious that she robbed him of his spectacle, but he allows her to be buried with Antony, in the tomb she prepared. And with that, the Ptolemaic dynasty, the line of Greek pharaohs ruling Egypt for centuries, ends. Egypt becomes a Roman province. Its grain, its wealth, its ancient prestige, all folded into Octavian's growing empire. Octavian, of course, plays it perfectly. He spreads the story of Antony's weakness, Cleopatra's seduction, and his own calm Roman virtue. The narrative is simple. Antony lost because he betrayed Roman values. Cleopatra lost because she was a manipulative foreign queen. Octavian won because he was the steady hand of Rome. It's propaganda, sure, but it sticks. And by the time Octavian sails back to Rome, he isn't just Caesar's heir anymore. He's the sole master of the Roman world. The Republic is gone. The Senate still sits, technically. Elections still happen, technically. But nobody's fooled. All power rests with Octavian. And soon he'll take on a new name, Augustus, the first emperor. And so the story of Actium and its messy aftermath in Alexandria ends not with some blazing final battle, but with two broken lovers choosing death, and one quiet, careful man walking away with everything. Rome has traded chaos for order, or maybe just traded one chaos for another. But the old republic, it's over, slipped away, like the sound of oars fading on a dark sea.
So, now Octavian is the last man standing. The Republic's endless carousel of generals, assassins, and would-be saviors has finally stopped spinning. It's just him, the 20-something with the frail body, the calm face, and the very sharp instincts. But here's the clever part. He doesn't strut into Rome declaring himself king. That would have been suicide. Romans hated kings. They'd spent centuries telling themselves they were better than monarchies. They'd bragged that while other peoples bowed to kings, Romans bowed only to the law. Of course, that was mostly a lie by now, but the myth still mattered. Octavian knew this. He knew you couldn't just crown yourself and expect applause. So instead, he put on the greatest political performance in history. He pretended, very convincingly, that he was restoring the Republic. In 27 BCE, he walks into the Senate and makes this big show of handing back all his powers, just giving them up. Here you go, senators, the Republic is yours again. My work is done. Of course, the Senate panics. They've grown used to strong men running the show. None of them actually want the responsibility. And besides, they all know Octavian controls the armies. So, after some theatrical back and forth, they insist he keep extraordinary powers, for the good of the state. How convenient. That's when he takes the name Augustus. Not king, not dictator, not emperor. Augustus. A word that meant revered one. Soft, religious, almost holy. It sounded less like a title of tyranny and more like a halo. And so the new system was born. The Principate. Officially, the Republic still existed. The Senate still met, consuls were still elected, magistrates still filled their posts, but over it all sat Augustus, holding imperium, controlling the provinces, commanding the armies, deciding the budgets, quietly, calmly, absolutely in charge. It was monarchy in everything but name, and because Augustus was smart enough never to say the word king, Romans accepted it. Now, the funny part is how thoroughly Augustus played the image game. He never dressed like a king. He dressed like any Roman noble. He lived in a modest house on the Palatine Hill. Well, modest by imperial standards anyway. He portrayed himself as the hard-working first citizen, the man who sacrificed for Rome. Meanwhile, his statues multiplied. Coins stamped with his face circulated everywhere. Temples rose, hymns were sung, poets praised him as the bringer of peace. It was humble tyranny, soft dictatorship, the velvet glove over the iron fist. And compared to the chaos of the late Republic, civil wars, assassinations, starving veterans, collapsing governments, Romans loved it. Stability at last, peace at last, even if it was peace under one man's thumb. So yes, the Republic technically still lived on paper, but everyone knew the truth. From Actium forward, Rome was no longer a republic. It was an empire, ruled by Augustus and his heirs. It's almost funny, really. Julius Caesar tried to seize power openly, and the knives came out. Octavian does it slowly, carefully, with a smile, and everyone cheers. Same result, different style. The Republic had died at Actium, on the waters of western Greece, but it was buried, quietly, in Rome, under Augustus's calm, careful hand. And Rome just kept marching, now under a single name.
And so Rome had peace. Not the fragile, uncertain peace of truces and armistices, but the kind that feels permanent, woven into the air itself. Augustus called it the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. For the first time in living memory, Romans weren't killing each other in endless civil wars. The legions still fought, of course, pushing the empire's borders farther and farther. But inside, at the heart of it all, Rome was calm. Daily life began to feel different. Markets bustled without fear of soldiers marching through. Farmers planted without worrying that generals would seize their harvests. Roads stretched like veins across the empire, tying Spain to Greece, Gaul to Judea, Egypt to Rome. You could, if you had the coin and the courage, travel the known world and find it paved in Roman stone. Augustus wanted more than stability. He wanted order, Roman order. He rebuilt temples, claiming to restore the old gods and the old ways. He passed laws about family, marriage, morality, even how citizens should behave. He didn't just want to rule their bodies, he wanted to rule their habits, their minds, their stories. And the stories took root. Poets like Virgil wrote of Rome's divine destiny, how it was fated to rule the world. Statues of Augustus showed him not as a fragile man, but as a flawless figure, young forever, pointing toward a shining future. The man who had quietly built a monarchy also quietly became a symbol, a god in everything but flesh. Still, beneath the calm surface, the shadow of Actium lingered. Everyone knew how Rome had gotten here. Not through elections, not through debate, but through the sea battle that ended a century of bloodshed. The waves of Actium had washed away the Republic. It is strange to think the Republic lasted for nearly 500 years, but in the end it wasn't destroyed by enemies or barbarians or kings. It collapsed from within, from ambition, greed, and endless war. And it was finished by a quiet, sickly young man who understood patience better than anyone else. Augustus reigned for decades, longer than anyone thought possible. When he finally died, Rome mourned, but Rome also accepted. By then, the Republic was a memory, a story told by old men who still dreamed of the Senate's glory. The empire was real, living, unshakable. And it all traced back to that moment, that silent turning point on the waters of Actium. Octavian against Antony, the rising sun against the fading twilight, the careful strategist against the reckless lover. A single morning that changed the world. Because from that morning forward, Rome would never be the same. The Republic was gone. The Empire had begun, and the shadow of Actium stretched across centuries.